Chapter 1. There is no one left. Mary Lennox was a very disagreeable child. She had a thin face and a thin body. Her light yellow hair was thin too. Mary was born in India. She was often ill. Her father worked for the English government. He was always busy and sick. Her mother was very beautiful. She only cared about going to parties. She did not want Mary. When Mary was born, her mother gave her to an ayah. The ayah was told to keep Mary out of sight. Mary was sick and fretful. She stayed out of the way. When she was older, she was still sick and unhappy. She stayed out of the way. She never saw many people. She only saw dark faces. The ayah and other servants always did what she wanted. The servants did not want to upset Mary's mother. Mary became very selfish and spoiled. She was a little tyrant. The governesses who tried to teach her left quickly. They did not want to stay. Mary wanted to learn to read. If she did not want to learn, she would not have learned at all. One hot morning, when Mary was about 9 years old, she woke up feeling very cross. She saw a strange woman by her bedside. Mary did not want her. She wanted her ayah. The woman looked scared. She said the ayah could not come. Mary threw a tantrum and beat the woman. The woman looked even more frightened. That morning, something was strange. Things were not done in order. Many servants were missing. The ones Mary saw looked scared. No one would tell her what was happening. Her ayah did not come. Mary went outside and played alone. She stuck flowers into the earth and muttered angrily. She heard her mother and a young officer talking. The young officer was from England. He was new and looked like a boy. Mary stared at her mother. She was tall and pretty. She wore lovely clothes and had curly hair. Her eyes were big and scared. The young man said they should have gone to the hills 2 weeks ago. Mary's mother was upset. She said she should have left earlier. Then Mary heard loud wailing from the servants' quarters. Her mother grabbed the officer's arm and ran into the house. Mary was very frightened. The cholera had come. It was very deadly. The ayah had died in the night. That was why the servants were wailing. Soon 3 more servants were dead. Others ran away. There was panic everywhere. People were dying. Mary hid in the nursery. Nobody thought of her. She cried and slept. She heard frightening sounds. Once she went into the dining room. It was empty, and food was left on the table. She ate some fruit and biscuits. She drank a glass of wine that made her very sleepy. She went back to her room and fell asleep. Mary slept for a long time. She did not hear the noise and chaos anymore. When she woke up, the house was silent. She wondered if everyone was better. She wondered who would take care of her. Her ayah was dead. No one came to look for her. Mary felt forgotten. Everyone was too worried about themselves. Nobody remembered her. As Mary waited, the house was still. She saw a little snake on the matting. It slipped out of the room. Mary thought it was quiet and strange. She heard footsteps outside. Men came into the house. They looked in rooms and talked quietly. One man was surprised to see Mary. He was an officer she had seen before. He looked tired and worried. When he saw Mary, he jumped back in surprise. "Barney!" he called. "There is a child here, alone, in a place like this. Who is she?" "I am Mary Lennox," said Mary. I fell asleep and just woke up. Why does nobody come?" The officer was shocked. He said Mary had been forgotten. He looked very sad. He told Mary that there was nobody left. Her parents had died. The servants who were not dead had left. The house was empty. Mary was alone. The only other living thing was the little snake. That was how Mary found out that she was all alone. Chapter 2. Mistress Mary. Quite contrary, Mary Lennox had always been alone with her thoughts. She had a mother she rarely saw, and she didn't feel close to her. Mary was more focused on herself than anyone else. She didn't miss her mother when she passed away, and she was used to being cared for by servants. Mary was sent to live with the English clergyman's family for a short while. She did not want to stay there. The clergyman was poor, and his 5 children were always fighting and wearing old clothes. Mary did not like them, and they did not like her. They gave her a nickname that made her very angry. Mistress Mary Quite Contrary. The nickname came from a teasing rhyme that Basil, a boy in the clergyman's house, sang. Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells, and cockle shells, and marigolds all in a row. Basil sang this to make Mary even more upset. He teased her about going to live with her uncle, Mr. Archibald Craven, who lived in a big, gloomy house in the country. Mary did not believe Basil's teasing at first, but she thought about it a lot. She was going to be sent to England to live with this uncle who she had never met before. When Mrs. Crawford told Mary that she would be traveling to England to live with Mr. Craven at Misselthwaite Manor, Mary did not show much emotion. She did not care much about her uncle or the new place she would live in. Mrs. Crawford and Mr. Crawford tried to be kind to her, but Mary did not respond warmly. Mrs. Crawford thought Mary was not a very pretty or pleasant child. She said that Mary's mother was beautiful, but Mary did not seem to have inherited any of her mother's charm. The children at the clergyman's house had given Mary the nickname Mistress Mary Quite Contrary because she was so difficult and unfriendly. Mary traveled to England on a ship with an officer's wife and her children. The officer's wife handed Mary over to Mrs. Medlock, Mr. Craven's housekeeper, in London. Mrs. Medlock was a large woman with a bright, colorful dress and a sharp, disapproving look. She did not think much of Mary and commented on how plain and unattractive she looked. Mary was curious about her new home and her uncle. Mrs. Medlock told her that Misselthwaite Manor was a grand but gloomy house on the edge of the moor. It had nearly 100 rooms, but most of them were locked up. There were old pictures, furniture, and a large park with gardens and trees. Mary was not very excited about the idea of moving to such a place. She thought it sounded dreary and boring. Mrs. Medlock told Mary that Mr. Craven, her uncle, was a grumpy man with a crooked back. He did not like to see people and spent most of his time in a part of the house called the West Wing, where he did not want anyone to enter. Mary listened to all this information with little interest, but she was curious about what her uncle and the house would be like. The thought of living in a large, locked-up house and not seeing her uncle often made her feel gloomy. She looked out the train window at the rainy, gray day and thought about how lonely she felt. She realized that she had never felt truly connected to anyone, not even her parents when they were alive. Now she was being sent to live with an uncle she knew nothing about in a strange, cold house. Despite the new and mysterious things waiting for her, Mary felt more unhappy and disconnected than ever. Chapter 3. Across the Moor. Mary slept for a long time. When she woke up, Mrs. Medlock had bought a lunch basket. They had chicken, cold beef, bread, butter, and hot tea. It was raining very hard, and everyone at the station was wearing wet, shiny raincoats. The guard lit the lamps in the carriage. Mrs. Medlock was very happy with her tea and food. She ate a lot and then fell asleep. Mary watched her until she fell asleep too, listening to the rain against the windows. When Mary woke up again, it was dark. The train had stopped at a station, and Mrs. Medlock was shaking her awake. "You have slept well," Mrs. Medlock said. "It's time to wake up. We're at Thwaite Station. We have a long drive ahead." Mary stood up and tried to stay awake while Mrs. Medlock gathered her things. Mary didn't help because in India, native servants carried things, and she thought it was right for others to help her. The station was small, and no one else was getting off the train. The station master spoke to Mrs. Medlock in a rough, friendly way with a broad accent. Mary later learned it was Yorkshire. "I see you're back," he said. "And you've brought the young one with you." "Yes, this is her," Mrs. Medlock answered, pointing to Mary. "How is your missus?" "She is well. The carriage is waiting outside." A smart carriage was waiting outside. Mary saw that the footman helping her into the carriage was also wearing a wet raincoat and hat. When the door was shut, the footman climbed onto the box with the coachman, and they started to drive. Mary was seated comfortably in the carriage, but she was curious about the place Mrs. Medlock had talked about. She was not afraid, but wondered about the house with 100 rooms, most of which were shut, standing on the edge of a moor. "What is a moor?" Mary asked Mrs. Medlock. "Look out of the window in about 10 minutes and you'll see," Mrs. Medlock replied. "We have to drive 5 miles across Missel Moor before we get to the manor. It's dark, but you can see a little." Mary waited quietly, looking out of the window. The carriage lamps lit the road ahead. She saw whitewashed cottages, a public house, a church, a vicarage, and a shop window with toys and sweets as they drove through a small village. Then they were on a high road with hedges and trees. After a while, there were no more hedges or trees, just darkness. The carriage jolted, and Mary leaned forward, pressing her face against the window. "We're on the moor now," Mrs. Medlock said. The carriage lamps showed a rough road cut through bushes and low plants, with a dark expanse all around. The wind was blowing and making a wild, rushing sound. "It's not the sea, is it?" Mary asked. "No," Mrs. Medlock said. "It's not fields or mountains. It's miles of wild land with only heather, gorse, and broom. Only wild ponies and sheep live here." "It feels like the sea," Mary said. "It sounds like the sea." "That's just the wind blowing through the bushes," Mrs. Medlock said. "It's a wild, dreary place to me, though some people like it, especially when the heather is in bloom." They drove on through the dark moor. The rain had stopped, but the wind whistled and made strange noises. The road went up and down, and they crossed several small bridges with rushing water underneath. Mary felt like the drive would never end, and the moor seemed like a black ocean. "I don't like it," Mary said to herself. "I don't like it," and she pressed her lips tightly together. The horses were climbing a hill when Mary saw a light. Mrs. Medlock saw it too and sighed in relief. "I'm glad to see that light," she said. "It's the lodge light. We'll get a good cup of tea soon." It took some time. When they passed through the park gates, there were still 2 miles of avenue to drive through. The trees nearly met overhead, making it feel like a long, dark tunnel. They drove out of the tunnel into a clear space and stopped before a very long, low house. At first, Mary thought there were no lights, but she saw a dim glow in one room upstairs. The entrance door was huge, made of oak with big iron nails and bars. It opened into a very large hall, dimly lit, making the portraits and suits of armor on the walls look scary. A neat, thin old man stood near the manservant who opened the door for them. "Take her to her room," he said in a husky voice. "He doesn't want to see her. He is going to London in the morning." "Very well, Mr. Pitcher," Mrs. Medlock said. "I will manage as long as I know what to do. Make sure he is not disturbed and does not see what he does not want to see," Mr. Pitcher said. Mary was then led up a broad staircase, down a long corridor, up a short flight of steps, and through more corridors until she reached a room with a fire and a table with supper on it. Mrs. Medlock said abruptly, "Here you are. This room and the next are where you'll live. You must stay in them. Don't forget that." This is how Mary Lennox arrived at Misselthwaite Manor. She had never felt so small and lost in her life. Chapter 4. Martha. When Mary woke up in the morning, it was because a young maid had come into her room to light the fire. Mary watched the maid, Martha, as she worked, and then looked around at the room. It was unlike any room she had ever seen, with its tapestry-covered walls depicting a forest scene with people, hunters, and animals. Outside the deep window, there was a vast stretch of moorland, which Mary found dull and unappealing. "What is that?" Mary asked, pointing outside. Martha looked out and answered with a grin, "That's the moor. Do you like it?" "No," Mary replied. "I hate it," Martha explained. "That's because you're not used to it, but you will like it." "Do you?" Mary asked. I do," Martha said cheerfully. "It's covered with growing things that smell sweet. It's lovely in spring and summer with flowers and fresh air. I wouldn't live away from the moor for anything." Mary was surprised by Martha's attitude. Her Indian servants had been very different, always bowing and showing deference. She wondered how Martha would react if she were treated the same way. "You are a strange servant," Mary said haughtily. Martha laughed and replied, "I know. If there was a grand Mrs. at Misselthwaite, I wouldn't even be an upstairs maid. But Mrs. Medlock gave me this job out of kindness, because Misselthwaite isn't like other big houses." "Are you going to be my servant?" Mary asked. "I'm Mrs. Medlock's servant," Martha said. "I'm here to help with the housemaid's work and look after you a bit, but you won't need much looking after." "Who is going to dress me?" Mary demanded. Martha was surprised. "Can't you dress yourself?" Mary was indignant. "No, I never have, My ayah dressed me." "Well, it's time you learned," Martha said. "It'll be good for you." Mary was furious. "You thought I was a native. How dare you?" Martha was taken aback but tried to explain. "I didn't mean to offend. I just thought you were a native because you're from India." Mary was so upset that she burst into tears. Martha, though puzzled, felt sorry for her and tried to comfort her. "It's time to get up now," Martha said. "I'll help you with your clothes if you get out of bed." Mary noticed that the clothes Martha had for her were different from the black ones she had worn when she arrived. "These are nicer," Mary said. Martha explained that Mr. Craven had ordered them because he didn't want Mary dressed in black. He thought it would make the place sadder. Mary reluctantly accepted the new clothes and was amazed at how different everything was from what she was used to. Martha continued to speak in her broad Yorkshire accent and told Mary about her family and their lives on the moor. Mary was intrigued, but tried to hide her interest. Martha talked about her brother Dickon, who had a young pony he had tamed. Mary had never had a pet and felt a spark of interest in Dickon. After breakfast, Mary decided to explore the gardens. Martha explained that one of the gardens was locked up and had not been entered for 10 years. Mary was curious and decided to look around. She found several walled gardens and an orchard, but did not find the locked garden. As Mary wandered, she saw a robin with a red breast and watched it with interest. The bird's cheerful song made her feel less lonely. She spoke to an old gardener who seemed surprised by her questions and eventually learned more about the robin and the gardens. Mary's curiosity about the locked garden grew, and she wondered what it looked like and why it was closed. Her exploration had begun to stir a new sense of wonder in her, making her eager to discover more. Chapter 5. The cry in the corridor. Mary Lennox's days at Misselthwaite Manor were very much the same. Each morning she woke up to find Martha building the fire, ate breakfast in the plain nursery, and looked out at the vast moor. To escape boredom, she started going outside every day. She didn't realize it, but running and walking in the fresh air was making her stronger and healthier. One morning, Mary noticed she was hungry and enjoyed her breakfast for the first time. Martha explained that the fresh air was making her appetite better. Mary didn't have toys to play with, so she just walked around the gardens and explored the park. She often looked for Ben Weatherstaff, but he was usually too busy to pay her any attention. Mary was curious about a part of the garden wall covered in thick ivy. One day, she saw a robin redbreast and began to follow him. The robin seemed to enjoy her company and even sang a song from a tree. Mary remembered the garden behind the wall that no one could enter. She tried to find a door but couldn't. Martha had said Mr. Craven buried the key. This mystery made Mary more interested in her surroundings. At dinner, Mary asked Martha why Mr. Craven hated the garden. Martha explained that it was Mrs. Craven's garden, and she loved it. She used to sit on a special tree branch covered in roses. One day, the branch broke, and Mrs. Craven was hurt and died. Mr. Craven was heartbroken and hasn't let anyone in the garden since. That night, while Mary sat by the fire, she heard a strange crying sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, But then she felt sure it was inside the house. When the wind blew the door open and the crying got louder, Mary was sure it was a child crying. Martha tried to dismiss it, saying it might be the scullery maid with a toothache, but Mary wasn't convinced.